Hello and welcome to the Philosophy of Psychology Key Concepts video for week 5. And this week we're looking at dual process theories. And in recent years, dual process theories have become quite popular as explanations in a number of fields in psychology, including social cognition, judgment, social psychology, and moral motivation. And a lot of areas where this sort of idea that we're made up of, that we have essentially two kinds of systems or two kinds of processes for thinking and for judging has proved quite useful in explaining a lot of how we sort of how we operate and how we sort of get into sometimes get into sort of conflict. So we're going to have a look at how this theory sort of came about, what sort of were the drivers for this theory, and then we'll sort of take a look at how it works and get a sense of it. So this is our last week on theories of mind or theories of the soul, and this is a kind of contemporary theory that looks at cognition in terms of these dual processes. So this is what we're going to be focusing on this week. Okay, so a big sort of impetus for dual process theory has been in areas of sort of cognitive rationality and areas where people have noticed the kind of a tendency to commit fallacies, certain kinds of fallacies, and the way this highlights a certain kind of conflict, a certain sort of underlying conflict in how we judge or how we make decisions. And the conjunction fallacy is one that Kahneman focused on and has been used quite often to illustrate this idea. So the conjunction fallacy, we can look at it through this example of this 31-year-old woman called Linda, who is single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So the question is, which of the following hypotheses is the more probable? Is it firstly that Linda is a bank teller, or secondly that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? So in the conjunction fallacy, people assume that specific conditions are more probable than a general version of those same conditions. Right? So to judge that it's more probable that Linda's a bank teller and a feminist cannot be correct, because the sort of the idea of being a bank teller is going to be broader than the idea of being a bank teller and a feminist, because those are two conditions, specific conditions which must apply. You must be a bank teller and a feminist, rather than simply a bank teller. So given certain kinds of information, people assume that those specific conditions are more probable than a bank teller. So it's more probable that Linda will be a bank teller and a feminist than simply a bank teller. And that is sort of logically not possible, logically incorrect. Specific conditions can't be more probable than a more general version of those same conditions. We can see it more clearly if we look at sort of the blue eyes and blonde hair, right? There's a sort of section of people who have blue eyes, section of people who have blonde hair, and in perhaps many cases those two overlap, and there's a population of people that has blue eyes and blonde hair. But those two conditions can't be more probable than any single condition. It can't be more probable that somebody has blue eyes and blonde hair than simply having blue eyes. Right, so it's judging the specific conditions is more probable. That's a kind of fallacy of reasoning that people tend to make. And so it sort of illustrates the way we kind of process things, and as we'll see, it gives some impetus to the idea that we're sort of characterized by sort of dueling or conflicting sort of processes for reaching decisions and judgments. So another example of the conjunction fallacy, we could ask, what is more likely? A man has a heart attack, or a man overweight and 68 years old has a heart attack? So again, we might look at it and we might judge the specific conditions. Well, overweight and 68 years old, you're likely to have a heart attack. So maybe that's more probable. But the answer is it can't be more probable than the single condition, man has heart attack. Again, there are going to be cases where men have heart attacks and they're not overweight and they're not 68 years old. And those cases are going to be more likely than the cases with specific conditions where a man is overweight and 68 years old and has a heart attack. So if we judge the second one here more probable, that's the conjunction fallacy. And so the question is, and we'll get to this shortly, why are we susceptible to making this kind of error? So what's going on to make us susceptible to this kind of error, where we can see, if we look at it sort of logically and we think it through, we can see where the error comes from, but it's hard to stop ourselves making this kind of error. Belief bias is another one that's been another sort of fallacy that's been discussed in this context. And the tendency for our beliefs to distort logical reasoning is belief bias, and this sometimes affects our conclusions. So basically, we're more likely to judge an argument as good if the answer seems plausible to us. If the conclusion seems like it makes sense to us, we're more likely to judge the argument as valid. But of course, the argument itself may not actually give us any evidence for the conclusion. It may be a bad argument and the conclusion is true, right? So we see here in our first example, some professors wear ties, some men wear ties, some professors are men. Now we might think, okay, well that's true, so therefore the argument must be a good one. It's true that some professors are men. But the argument gives us no support for the conclusion. So the argument is not a good one, even though the conclusion seems valid. So in belief bias, what we do is we use our sort of judgment of the plausibility of the conclusion to judge that the argument is good, even though in fact it doesn't give us any evidence for the conclusion. And we can see that in the second example below here. We can simply adjust the argument to say, some professors wear ties, some scarecrows wear ties, so some professors must be scarecrows, right? Which has the same logical structure as the first argument, but it shows us what's wrong with it. All that we're told is that there are some profs with ties, some scarecrows with ties, but we don't know if they're an overlapping group or if they're the same group. We can't judge that from the argument that we're given. So we can't draw the judgment that some professors are scarecrows, right? So we can see that the conclusion is wrong here because the argument is wrong because the conclusion is obviously bad. Some professors are not scarecrows. But in belief bias, if the conclusion seems plausible to us, we'll let it sort of drive our assumption that the argument is a good one, even though it's not. So the question here is, do these cognitive biases provide evidence of mental fragmentation or mental conflict? Conflict seems apparent between sort of logical reasoning and rule-based judgments. We've seen that in the arguments we've looked at, the conjunction fallacy and belief bias, and our decision-making. So our decision-making seems to sort of stray from these sort of logical rule-based judgments. Does that suggest that there is a kind of conflict, a kind of fragmentation? And remember, we saw a similar kind of argument in Plato when we looked at Plato's theory of the soul, right? Plato identifies these different sort of points of conflict when our desire is telling us one thing and our reason is sort of telling us another, and they're sort of pulling in different directions. our spirit and our desire, our spirit and reason are pulling in different directions. So it's when we sense that conflict that we have a sort of awareness of these different pieces of our mental furniture, these different sort of parts of our soul that are sort of pulling in different directions. They're in conflict. So this is the way the sort of argument for dual process theory works, that we've got this mental fragmentation that becomes apparent in the way we make these judgments, and we fall into these kind of fallacies of reasoning. So dual process theory tells us that biases of the kind we've talked about and impaired decision making in general occur because human reasoning relies on two very different types of systems or processes. Okay, we've got a system 1 and a system 2. And so ordinarily we'll rely on the automatic and sort of fast process, but we also have a kind of more slow, logical, and effortful process, and that's system 2. So one process is serial and rule governed, system 2. The other is kind of parallel and connectionist or associationist. In other words, system 1 relies on kind of environmental associations between things that have built up over time. And it sort of uses those to drive automatic responses to new things we encounter in the environment. Whereas system 2 is more about sort of following sort of rules and sort of using our knowledge to sort of draw conclusions. So we can see a list of the qualities of system 1 and system 2 here. These have been attributed to the two systems by different thinkers. We see with system 1 we've got a system that's evolutionarily old. In other words, it's a more sort of older basic system than system 2, which is thought to be sort of developed in the frontal cortex, in the sort of later sort of frontal parts of the brain that give us this cognitive advantage. So the old system is kind of unconscious. We're not aware of it working, whereas we're conscious of our kind of system 2, our sort of rule-based system. System 1 is thought to be shared with animals. System 2 is this distinctly human system that we've sort of that our sort of brains, the growth of our brains has enabled us to develop on top of the old system that we share with other creatures. And it's explicit rather than implicit, controlled rather than automatic, and slow rather than fast. So all these sort of differences tell us about the way system 2 works, that it's a decontextualized system, so it takes thoughts or ideas or things out of their context and sort of looks at them in a sort of rule-governed, conscious, sequential kind of way. And so it's a very different type of system. We might say system 1 is like an automatic processor. We kind of do things without thinking about them. So we don't count our steps when we walk. We don't sort of do physics when we throw a ball. We're just relying on our sort of basic automatic sort of knowledge about how to do things and what happens when we throw a ball and so on. So system 1 allows us to get along without conscious effort. So obviously that can be immensely useful to us. We don't need to sort of spend cognitive energy on sort of doing things that we sort of do on a daily basis. The slower thinking of system 2 allows us to think our way through the key factors and reach logical, informed decisions. So here's the thing about system 2. It's pretty much useless when we're being chased by a large, hungry bear, right? There we've got to rely on our sort of intuitive knowledge, our sort of fast knowledge of what to do in an instant without sort of going through this reflective serial thinking process. So an essential feature of system 2 is its use of working memory to perform tasks. So it relies on our sort of working memory to help us perform these logical sort of rule-based tasks, holding things in our working memory and allowing us to work with those things while we sort of do this sort of rule-based logical sort of processing. All right, so there's a number of ways of thinking about this idea of duality and how it sort of operates. And three distinct ideas have been proposed. We've got the idea of dual process, where we may have two distinct processing modes available for many cognitive tasks. We've got dual systems, where there are two multi-purpose reasoning systems, System 1 and System 2. And thirdly, we might think of them as a kind of attitude or a state, an explicit and an implicit attitude or mental state towards the same object. So we may have a sort of, a sort of type 1 or process 1 attitude that's driven by our sort of slow, sort of fast and unconscious system, and a sort of type 2 attitude, which is sort of driven by our conscious thinking. So type 1 processes are probably a collection of processes working together. So in other words, it's not one process, but a number of processes for perception and different kind of cognitive tasks that are kind of working together to allow us to sort of work this fast unconscious system and to make decisions in that way. The idea of dual systems suggests that dual processes have some kind of foundation in cognitive architecture, leading to distinct systems. In other words, they're kind of built into our brain, and they're sort of built into the architecture of our brain in the way that we can sort of identify two different kind of working systems. One question here might be, why are there only two systems? Or why might we think, why can't there be more systems? Might it be a claim about the number of kinds of mechanisms or processes, right? Maybe there's a number of sort of mechanisms that work on a sort of on a sort of type 2 profile, and a sort of series of mechanisms that work in a kind of type 1, can work together to form a type 1 process. So then we may say there are many cognitive processes, but they fall into two overarching categories. So that's one way we might think about dual systems. Now, when we think about dual state, dual attitude, different ways of priming a question can give rise to different attitudes, and we can see that emerging when we sort of prime people in different ways. Attitudes seem highly context dependent. An example of this is that married people were invited to give extrinsic reasons why they are married. In other words, not sort of emotional reasons, but sort of, useful instrumental reasons why they're married. Those people ended up judging their partner and chances of living together long term more negatively. So it's an attitude that's been kind of primed by a particular question. And if you prime it a different way and ask them about their emotional connection rather than their sort of instrumental connection, you'd get a much different response. So these attitudes can kind of coexist that reflect these different sort of approaches, and we can sort of, you can sort of bring out those attitudes by asking different questions. Okay, so a significant question here is how do the models work, or how do they interact? How do they relate to one another? And there are three models that have been proposed: the default interventionist model, the parallel competitive model, and the lawyer-client model. The default interventionist model suggests that type 2 processes they hang back and they sort of wait to intervene. Maybe we could suggest they're lazy. They sort of let the type 1 processes run until there's a problem, and then they intervene. So type 2 processes are they're seen as kind of a sort of later way, if something goes wrong, they'll intervene, or if something's obviously not working, they'll sort of come into the picture. But they're default interventionists. They wait until there's an issue, Otherwise, it's like we're content to run on the type 1 processes that kind of run automatically until something comes up that needs some kind of explicit cognitive treatment. The parallel competitive model assumes there's a kind of competition between the two processes. So they both kind of compete for sort of making the decision, and they're kind of always sort of working to try and be to sort of be the kind of winner of the competition. An interesting question here is who judges the winner? Is there a third kind of process that sort of judges between them? Or how do we kind of model that? Which one is more, which answer is more influential and who judges? So we need to get more specific about those sort of questions to really see how the model works. Now, the lawyer-client model suggests that all that the type 2 processes do is provide a kind of post hoc rationalization. In other words, they give a kind of after-the-fact rationalization of why decisions were made, but they don't actually reflect the real reasons why those decisions were made, because type 2 processes don't really understand what type 1 processes are doing. So this is an idea that, type 2 processes, our kind of rational brain, is pretty is not as effective or useful as we take it to be. In other words, what it's doing is not making decisions, but simply rationalizing what happens and the kind of decisions and judgments taken by the type 1 ancient processes in our brain. It's just sort of rationalizing, giving us reasons for those processes, but not actually sort of making decisions or judgments itself. So the type 2 processes are kind of surface and superficial, I think, according to the lawyer-client model, in a way that they're not necessarily according to the other two models. So there are two ways of thinking about dual state theory. We can have a kind of non-doxastic version. And we're given that by this example of Gendler and sort of beliefs and alifs. So the question here is, how do we characterize these dual states or these dual attitudes? Are they both beliefs, or is something else going on? So a non-doxastic state is not a belief state. In other words, it doesn't involve beliefs. And these are things that Gendler calls alifs to distinguish them from beliefs. An alif may have some of the behavioral and affective responses that characterize belief, but it's not a full belief state. And her example is one of these skywalks, when somebody sort of steps on the skywalk and you can see below, and it's like, you have this sort of fear that you're going to fall. So she characterizes the sort of fear as an alif. In other words, you don't really believe it, but you feel that kind of fear when you step onto the glass. You have that kind of affective response. Oh my God, I'm going to fall. Even though at the same time you have the actual belief that the walkway is safe. Otherwise you wouldn't have stepped on it. So you have the belief that it's safe, and you have the alif, which is not quite a belief, although it has some of the properties, that the walkway is not safe at the same time. So that's supposed to explain that sort of conflict that's going on when you're thinking, I'm safe, I'm not safe, in those kind of situations. Now there's a doxastic version of the same dual state theory, which looks at both of the two beliefs, or the two attitudes, as both being like beliefs. They both have the status of beliefs. According to Frankish, there's type 1 beliefs, which are unconscious and automatic, and type 2 beliefs that are conscious and deliberative, but they're both things we're committed to as beliefs. Schwittz-Gable proposes this idea of in-between beliefs. Now, these are things which may have some, but not all, of the dispositional properties of beliefs. An example of an in-between belief is, say, Sylvia, who systematically prefers to sit next to a white person than a black person on the bus. Now, the presumption here is that she cannot, in the type 1 sense, believe in racial equality, right? It's her sort of type 1 beliefs that are making her, that are sort of leading her towards this systematic preference of sitting next to a white person on the bus. So she doesn't believe in racial equality in the type 1 sense, but maybe if you asked her, she would believe it in the type 2 sense. In other words, she would say that she believes in equality, egalitarianism, etc. But in fact, her type 1 beliefs are sort of leading her to sort of act against that explicit type 1 belief and to act on these sort of racial preferences that she holds in a type 1 sense. So work on automaticity being done in psychology includes studies showing that stereotypes are powerful implicit knowledge structures that influence social behavior in spite of explicit attitudes that are egalitarian. And maybe that's what we have here when we have these sort of beliefs showing up that have sort of when we have this conflict between, things we're explicitly committed to in the type 2 sense that we're conscious and sort of aware of, but those are in conflict with beliefs that we have in the type 1 sense, which, remember, can be sort of unconscious and just sort of guide our behavior without us necessarily being aware of it. And it might explain conflicts of this kind that occur between our attitudes and social judgments. Okay, so we've seen the dual process theory this week, and in this video we've talked about the relation between the sort of quick and automatic type 1 processes and the slow, deliberate and conscious type 2 processes. What I want you to think about in the discussion post for this week is which model best applies to the interaction between dual process theory, between type 1 and type 2 processes. Which model applies best to the interaction? We talked about the default interventionist model, where type 1 is default, type 2 is sort of coming in where necessary. We talked about the sort of parallel competitive theory, and we also talked about the lawyer-client model, which sees type 2 processes as kind of rationalizing decisions that are made by the type 1 processes, so a much kind of weaker role for type 2 processes. So that's what I want you to think about in your discussion post. Which model applies best to the interaction between them and why?